I stood by my parents' graves, my fingers tightening into fists as the final shovel of dirt was thrown over them. The air smelled of damp earth and wilting flowers, but all I could taste was bitterness. Jake was already stepping away, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive suit like this was just another business deal he had to attend. No grief, no reflection, just impatience. I turned to him, my voice low. We should go back to the house. There's a lot to figure out. Jake scoffed, barely looking at me. We. He let the word hang between us like an insult. There's nothing to figure out, actually. A cold dread settled in my gut. What do you mean? He straightened his tie, offering me the same smug smirk he had perfected as a teenager. I mean, you don't live there anymore. My breath caught in my throat. What? Jake exhaled dramatically as if he were exhausted by my ignorance. The house belongs to me now. A sharp, sinking feeling clawed its way up my chest. No. That was Mom and Dad's house. Our house. Jake shrugged. And now it's mine. My pulse pounded in my ears. I glanced around at the few remaining mourners, distant relatives, family, friends, people who had known us since childhood, but no one spoke up. They stood awkwardly, whispering amongst themselves, avoiding my gaze. Jake clapped a hand on my shoulder, his grip too tight to be comforting. You should start packing. His lips curled upward. Actually, never mind. I already did it for you. I felt the blood drain from my face. Jake's smile widened, enjoying my reaction. Your stuff is on the porch. Thought I'd save you the trouble. I stepped back, shaking my head, disbelief and fury battling for control. My voice faltered. You went through my things. You threw me out before our parents were even in the ground. Jake clicked his tongue. It's not personal, just business. I laughed. A sharp, humorless sound. Business? Are you serious? He sighed, rubbing his temple as if I was some inconvenience. Look, let's not make this dramatic. You don't belong in that house anyway. You left years ago. I was the one who stayed behind. My stomach twisted. Stayed behind? You barely visited. I was the one taking care of them while you were out living your life. Jake's expression darkened, his patience thinning. And what do you have to show for it? Nothing. Because you don't have the papers, but I do. His words hit like a slap. Papers. Legal documents. Something was off. Our parents had never mentioned signing anything over to him. In fact, they had reassured me time and time again that everything would be split fairly between us. But before I could press further, he took a step closer, lowering his voice. Don't fight this, all right? It's done. A lump formed in my throat, but I forced myself to stand tall. This isn't over, Jake. He chuckled, turning away. Yeah, it is. I drove to the house with shaking hands, my heart hammering in my chest. Every memory was tied to this place. Every scrape on the walls, every creak in the floorboards. It was home. Or at least it had been. When I pulled up to the driveway, my stomach dropped. My belongings were scattered on the porch in a mess of boxes and bags. Clothes half folded, books thrown carelessly into containers, even framed photos cracked from being tossed without care. My whole life dumped like garbage. I got out of the car slowly, my body buzzing with anger and disbelief. Jake had changed the locks. The front door had a brand new keypad, the old keyhole sealed over. A clear message: you're not welcome here. Tears burned behind my eyes, but I swallowed them down. I bent down, lifting a fallen photograph from the pile. One of me and Dad on the front steps taken years ago. His arm was around my shoulder, his smile warm and full of pride. This wasn't just a house. It was the last real piece of them I had left. And Jake had stolen it from me. I clenched my jaw, shoving the picture into my bag before grabbing what little I could carry. Then I saw the front window. Through the glass, I spotted Jake lounging on the couch with a drink in his hand, laughing as if nothing had happened. The house already looked different. Some of Mom's decorations removed, Dad's favorite chair missing. Jake was erasing them piece by piece. I wanted to storm in, scream, demand answers, but I couldn't. Not yet. I loaded the boxes into my car, each movement slow and deliberate. I didn't have a plan yet, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let this stand. As I slammed the trunk shut, my gaze flickered to the second-floor window, Dad's office. A memory sparked. Dad had kept important documents locked away. Papers, financial records. Maybe even something Jake hadn't found. A flicker of hope ignited in my chest. I looked back at the house one last time, my hands tightening into fists. Jake thought he'd won. He had no idea what was coming. That night, I sat in my car outside a friend's apartment staring at my phone. Messages had started coming in from extended family. Some were supportive. Others were indifferent. But one text caught my eye. Aunt Marilyn, your father would never have left you with nothing. Something doesn't add up. If you need help, let me know. I exhaled slowly. Marilyn had always been close to Dad, closer than most. If anyone knew something I didn't, it was her. I typed back quickly, did Dad ever mention a will? Anything about the house? Her reply came fast. He told me everything was supposed to be fair between you and Jake. If he changed that, I never heard about it. But maybe someone else did. My grip on the phone tightened. Jake had a way of convincing people to look the other way. He was charming when he needed to be. Manipulative when it suited him. But this wasn't over. I was going to get my home back. And I wasn't going to stop until Jake was the one packing his bags. I stared at my phone, Aunt Marilyn's message burning into my mind. Your father would never have left you with nothing. Something doesn't add up. He was right. Nothing about this felt right. My father was a man of fairness. He had always promised that when the time came, everything would be split equally. So why had Jake suddenly become the sole owner of the house? I tightened my grip on my phone. If there was any proof that Jake had manipulated the situation, it would be in Dad's safe. But there was one problem: I was locked out of my own home. I exhaled sharply and ran a hand through my hair. Breaking in was out of the question. Jake wasn't the type to take trespassing lightly. He'd probably call the cops just to humiliate me further. I needed another way. Aunt Marilyn was my best shot. Without wasting another second, I called her. She picked up after the first ring. Sweetheart, she said, her voice warm but laced with concern. I was hoping you'd call. Aunt Marilyn, I breathed. I need to know everything you remember. Anything about a will, legal documents, anything. There was a pause. Then she sighed. I don't know all the details, but I do know your father spoke with his lawyer a few months before he passed. He was very clear about wanting to protect you both. My heart pounded. Do you know the lawyer's name? Yes. It was, oh, what was it? I heard papers rustling in the background before she finally said, Michael Hensley. He's been handling the family's affairs for years. I grabbed a notepad and scrawled the name down. Where's his office? She hesitated. Downtown. But sweetheart, if there was a will and Jake managed to keep it hidden, there's a chance Mr. Hensley isn't being entirely honest. I swallowed hard. The thought hadn't even crossed my mind. You think he might have helped Jake? I think money can make people do things they shouldn't. I clenched my jaw. If Jake had somehow paid off the family lawyer, it meant I was fighting against more than just my brother. I was up against an entire system that had already decided to erase me. But I wasn't going down without a fight. The next morning, I walked into Michael Hensley's law office, my heart hammering in my chest. It was a sleek, intimidating place. Glass walls, expensive furniture, the kind of office that screamed power. The receptionist barely glanced at me before muttering, "Do you have an appointment?" "I need to see Mr. Hensley," I said, keeping my voice steady. "It's about my father's estate." She gave me a tight, dismissive smile. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Hensley is very busy. I'm not leaving until I speak with him." She opened her mouth to protest, but before she could, a door at the end of the hall swung open. A man in his 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes stepped out. His tailored suit was pristine, and the moment his gaze landed on me, something flickered in his expression. Recognition, maybe even guilt. "Mr. Hensley," I called before he could disappear. "I need a moment." He hesitated, then forced a polite smile. "Miss Bennett. I was expecting you." That caught me off guard. "You were." He motioned for me to follow him into his office, closing the door behind us. The air inside was thick with the scent of old books and leather. He gestured to a chair. "Please sit." I stayed standing. "Did my father leave a will?" His jaw tightened. "Why do you ask?" I folded my arms. Because I was thrown out of my own home less than an hour after burying my parents, and somehow my brother has full ownership of everything. He exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple. "Miss Bennett." "Stop," I cut him off. "I need the truth. Did my father leave a will or not?" For a moment he said nothing. Then finally he walked to a locked filing cabinet, pulled out a key and opened a drawer. He retrieved a thick folder, turning it over in his hands before looking up at me. There was a will, he admitted. My stomach dropped. Then why wasn't I given a copy? Hensley hesitated again, then walked back to his desk, laying the folder down. Because the will disappeared. I blinked. Disappeared. He nodded grimly. Your father signed a will ensuring both you and Jake would receive equal shares of the estate. However, after his passing, that document was no longer in our files. My blood ran cold. Jake. Hensley didn't deny it. He simply pressed his lips together. I have no proof of what happened. But, soon after your father passed, Jake came to my office with a new document. One that listed him as the sole heir. I felt sick. And you just accepted that? Hensley sighed. I had no choice. Without the original will, I had nothing to contest it. I shook my head in disbelief. So you just let him take everything? I had my suspicions, he admitted, leaning forward. But suspicions aren't evidence. I was legally bound to proceed with the document presented to me. Anger boiled inside me. My father had gone through the trouble of making sure I was protected, only for Jake to wipe it all away with a few well-placed lies. I clenched my fist. Is there any way to prove my father's will existed? Hensley hesitated, then nodded. Your father kept a personal copy of all his documents. If you can find it, you might have a case. My heart pounded. I needed to get into that house. I left the office with my mind racing. If the original will still existed, it would be in Dad's safe, hidden away where Jake hadn't found it yet. But how was I supposed to get in? I couldn't just waltz through the front door. Jake had locked me out. I needed a plan. Then as I drove past the house, I saw it. The side window on the second floor, Dad's office window, was slightly open. My pulse quickened. It wasn't much, but it was an opportunity. A small opening. A chance. I parked a few streets away, waiting for nightfall. Jake was careless. He thought he had won. But he had underestimated me. And tonight I was going to prove it. I sat in my car a few streets away from the house, watching the glow of the porch light flicker through the trees. The place that had once been my home now felt like a fortress I needed to break into. Jake had locked me out, but he hadn't erased me. Not yet. I checked the time, 11:47 p.m. If I was going to do this, it had to be now. I zipped up my hoodie, pulled the drawstrings tight, and stepped out into the cool night air. The grass was damp under my sneakers as I moved through the shadows, sticking to the side fence. A dog barked in the distance. My breath caught in my throat, but I forced myself to keep moving. The side gate was locked. Of course it was. I knew every inch of this house, every security measure Dad had installed. But Jake? He was lazy. He never paid attention to the little details. I slipped around to the back where the wooden fence met the side of the garage. Years ago, Dad had reinforced the panels, but time had loosened the nails. I pressed my hands against the weakest section and pushed. Nothing. I braced my foot against the base and shoved harder. A faint crack split through the night as the wood shifted just enough for me to squeeze through. I was in. My heart hammered against my ribs as I crouched behind the tool shed, my eyes scanning the house. The second-floor office window, my way in, was still slightly open. But I needed a way up. I crept toward the garage and reached for the old trellis nailed to the wall. Mom had once trained roses to climb up the latticework, but now it was nothing but brittle, peeling wood. Would it hold my weight? I didn't have a choice. I grabbed onto the first rung and pulled myself up. The wood groaned beneath my grip, but I climbed faster, ignoring the way my arms ached. Halfway up, a car turned onto the street. I pressed myself against the wall, heart pounding. The headlights swept past, illuminating the yard for a brief second before disappearing. I exhaled slowly. A few more steps. I reached the window, fingers barely brushing the edge. One more pull. I swung my leg up and scrambled inside, collapsing onto the carpet with a soft thud. I was in. The room smelled the same. Faint traces of my father's cologne lingered in the air, mixing with the scent of old paper and wood polish. For a second I felt like a child again, sneaking into Dad's office to watch him work. But this wasn't a visit. This was war. I turned toward the safe. It was tucked behind the bookshelf just like I remembered. Jake hadn't even bothered to move it, probably because he assumed I'd never get the chance to open it. I knelt in front of the heavy steel door, fingers tracing the combination lock. Dad's birthday. I spun the dial, May 17, 62, and held my breath as I turned the handle. Nothing. I swallowed hard. What else? I tried Mom's birthday. My birthday. Even Jake's. Still nothing. Panic crept in. Had Jake changed the code? Had Dad locked it with something only he knew? Then a memory flickered. Dad's watch. The one he wore every single day. The one engraved with a date. The day he and Mom bought this house. I spun the dial, September 24th, 89. The lock clicked. My breath hitched. I pulled the door open. Inside, folders and documents were stacked neatly in rows. I grabbed the thickest one, flipping it open. And there was my father's original will. Jake's name wasn't listed as the sole heir. Mine was right beside his. Equal. Just like Dad had promised. My hands trembled as I skimmed through the pages. This was proof. Proof that Jake had stolen everything. Proof that he had lied. I needed to get this to Aunt Marilyn. To a lawyer. To someone who could undo what Jake had done. But before I could move, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps coming down the hall. Jake. My pulse skyrocketed. I shoved the documents into my hoodie and closed the safe as quietly as I could. Then I backed toward the window, ready to slip out. The door creaked open. Jake's shadow stretched across the room. I froze. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then his voice, low and dangerous. What the hell do you think you're doing? I turned slowly, keeping my face blank. What are you doing up? He narrowed his eyes. I heard something. His gaze flicked to the safe, then back to me. His expression darkened. You were trying to steal something, weren't you? I forced a dry laugh. Steal? From my own house. He took a step closer. It's not your house anymore. I clenched my fist. That's what you want to believe. Something shifted in his expression. Something uneasy. He wasn't sure what I had found. I needed to use that. I squared my shoulders. I know what you did, Jake. His jaw tightened. You don't know anything. I tilted my head. Don't I? For the first time, doubt flickered in his eyes. Good. I needed him off balance. You can keep lying, I continued, keeping my voice steady, but the truth has a funny way of coming out. His nostrils flared. Get out. I took a step toward him, standing my ground. I'm going. But don't get too comfortable, Jake. This isn't over. I brushed past him, feeling his anger radiate off him like heat. But he didn't stop me. Not yet. As I walked out of the house, my hands curled around the papers hidden in my hoodie. Jake had taken everything from me. But now, I had exactly what I needed to take it all back. I walked away from the house, the weight of the documents pressing against my chest. The cool night air should have felt like a relief, but my body was wired, my mind racing. Jake hadn't stopped me. Not yet. But I knew him well enough to understand that he wouldn't just let this go. I slid into my car and locked the doors. My fingers trembled as I pulled out my phone and dialed the one person I knew would pick up no matter the hour. The line rang twice before a groggy voice answered. Hello. Aunt Marilyn, it's me, I whispered, still watching the house in my rearview mirror. I found it. Dad's real will. Pause. Then she was wide awake. Where are you? She asked urgently. In my car. Near the house. Get out of there. I swallowed hard. I don't think Jake's going to let me just walk away with this. She cursed under her breath. Listen to me, come straight here. We'll get a lawyer first thing in the morning. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Okay. I ended the call and started the engine, my hands gripping the wheel. But as I pulled onto the road, headlights flared in my mirrors. The car. Jake's car. I pressed my foot down on the gas. The road was dark, the streetlights few and far between. My pulse pounded as I watched the headlights keep pace with me. Then he sped up. He was chasing me. My knuckles turned white on the steering wheel. I couldn't go home, he knew where I lived. I couldn't lead him to Aunt Marilyn either. I took a sharp left, tires screeching against the pavement. The streets blurred past as I pushed the car faster, weaving through the empty roads. But Jake was right behind me. A turn. Another turn. I was running out of options. Then up ahead I spotted an old gas station. Closed, dark, abandoned. I made a split-second decision. I killed the headlights and swerved into the lot, coasting to a silent stop behind the building. Heart hammering, I killed the engine and slumped down in my seat. Seconds later, Jake's car roared past, tires screeching as he sped down the road. I waited. 1 minute. 2. Then I exhaled, my breath shaky. I had to get to Aunt Marilyn before he figured out where I was going. I restarted the car and took the back roads, avoiding the main streets. By the time I pulled into her driveway, my hands were still trembling. She was already waiting at the door. The moment I stepped inside, she pulled me into a tight hug. "Are you okay?" she asked, pulling back to study my face. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if it was true. She ushered me inside, locking the door behind me. "Let me see it." I pulled the papers from my hoodie and handed them over. Her eyes scanned the pages, her expression shifting from relief to anger. "This is it," she murmured. "This is exactly what we need." I sat down, rubbing a hand over my face. Jake's not going to let this slide. He already tried to stop me tonight. Aunt Marilyn's lips pressed into a thin line. "Let him try. He doesn't have the law on his side anymore." She set the documents down carefully. "I'll call the lawyer first thing in the morning. For now, you need rest." Rest. I hadn't realized how exhausted I was until that moment. I nodded, but I knew sleep wouldn't come easy. The next morning we met with the lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Evelyn Carter. She studied the will, flipping through the pages carefully. "This is solid," she finally said, looking up. "This is the original, notarized and legally binding. The changes Jake made? They won't hold up in court." Relief washed over me. "So what happens now?" Evelyn leaned back. "We file an injunction. He won't be able to sell the house, move assets, or touch anything until this is settled. Then we take him to court." It was happening. For the first time since Jake had thrown me out, I felt like I had a fighting chance. Aunt Marilyn reached over and squeezed my hand. Jake was about to learn that actions had consequences. That evening, a knock echoed through Aunt Marilyn's house. Insistent. I didn't need to look through the peephole to know who it was. I opened the door. Jake stood on the porch, his expression a storm of fury. "You think you're smart, don't you?" he seethed, stepping forward. I didn't move. "I think I'm done letting you walk all over me." His jaw clenched. "You don't get it. You're messing with things you don't understand." I folded my arms. "What's there to understand, Jake? That you forged documents? That you stole from me?" His nostrils flared. "Dad wanted me to have it. He knew I'd take care of it." I let out a dry laugh. "You mean the way you're taking care of everything? You were ready to sell the house, weren't you?" His silence was answer enough. I shook my head. "It's over, Jake. The lawyer already filed the injunction. You can't sell anything. You can't touch Dad's assets. And soon, you'll have to answer for what you did." For the first time, I saw something other than anger in his eyes. Panic. Pure, undeniable panic. He had spent years controlling everything, and now? The walls were closing in. He took a step back, his fists clenching at his sides. "You think this makes you better than me?" I tilted my head. "No. But it makes me smarter." His lips curled into something bitter. "You want to destroy me, don't you?" I held his gaze. "I just want what's mine." He stared at me for a long moment, the weight of reality settling on his shoulders. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. I exhaled slowly, my heart still hammering. Aunt Marilyn stepped beside me. "He knows it's over." I nodded. "Yeah. But he's not going down without a fight." And I was ready for it. Jake's footsteps faded into the night, but the weight of his presence lingered. I shut the door, locking it even though I knew he wouldn't be back tonight. He was panicking, but he wasn't stupid. He knew the moment he laid a hand on me, he'd lose whatever slim chance he had left. So I didn't trust him. Aunt Marilyn stood beside me, her arms crossed. "He's scared." "Good," I muttered. "He should be." She nodded toward the living room. "Come sit. We need to talk about what happens next." I followed her in and sank onto the couch, my mind still racing. The adrenaline of the confrontation hadn't worn off yet, but I knew this fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. "The injunction was just the first step," Aunt Marilyn said, pouring me a cup of tea. "Evelyn's filing a formal lawsuit. Once it's processed, Jake will be legally forced to answer for what he did. I stared at the steam curling from the cup. And if he refuses? He won't have a choice, she said. Ignoring a court order will only make things worse for him. I exhaled, gripping the warm ceramic. I just want this to be over. He gave me a knowing look. It will be. But justice takes time. The next week was a blur of legal meetings and paperwork. Evelyn was relentless, filing every necessary motion to freeze Dad's assets and ensure Jake couldn't make another move. I expected him to fight back. But he didn't. Instead, he did what he always did. He tried to manipulate the situation in his favor. 3 days after our confrontation, I got a text from an unknown number. Let's talk. No lawyers. Just us. I stared at the message, my stomach twisting. Aunt Marilyn didn't hesitate. Absolutely not. But I needed to hear what he had to say. So I replied. Tomorrow. Noon. The diner by Main Street. Public place. He agreed. The next day I sat in a corner booth, my hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Jake walked in 5 minutes late, looking nothing like the arrogant brother who had thrown me out of my own home. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, dark circles under his eyes. He slid into the seat across from me, exhaling slowly. You really went through with it, huh? I didn't say anything. I just watched him. He let out a humorless chuckle. You always were stubborn. I arched a brow. You didn't come here to compliment me. His fingers drummed against the table. Look, I get it. You're mad. But do we really have to drag this through the courts? Lawyers are expensive and neither of us needs the stress. I scoffed. Oh, so now you care about my stress? He sighed. I'm just saying, maybe there's a way we can settle this without making it ugly. I leaned forward. Jake, you forged a will. You stole everything Dad left behind and threw me out like I was nothing. And now that you're backed into a corner, you want to settle? His jaw clenched. It's not like that. Then what is it like? I demanded. He looked away. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I deserved it. I stared at him, my anger simmering beneath the surface. Deserved it? Why? He swallowed. Because Dad always saw me as a failure. His voice was quiet, almost ashamed. He was always so proud of you. The responsible one. The smart one. The one who never screwed up. Me. I was just the disappointment. For a brief second I saw something I hadn't expected. Vulnerability. But it didn't erase what he had done. I took a slow breath. You had a choice, Jake. Instead of stepping up and proving him wrong, you lied. You stole. And now you're paying for it. His fingers curled into fists. I can't lose everything. I met his gaze. Then you should have thought about that before you took everything from me. Silence stretched between us. He exhaled sharply. So that's it? You're really going through with this? I nodded. I am. His lips pressed into a thin line. Then I guess I'll see you in court. He stood abruptly, tossing a few bills onto the table and walked out. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty space he left behind. The trial came quicker than I expected. Jake tried to delay it, but Evelyn was 2 steps ahead of him. When he finally showed up in court, his arrogance was gone. He knew he had already lost. The evidence was overwhelming. Dad's original will, the financial discrepancies, the forged documents. It was all there, laid out for the judge to see. Jake didn't even try to fight it. He took the stand, his voice quiet as he admitted to everything. The judge ruled in my favor. The house was legally mine again. Dad's assets were restored to their rightful place. Jake was fined heavily for his actions, and while he avoided jail time, he was left with nothing but debt and a tarnished name. I should have felt victorious. But as I watched him leave the courtroom, his shoulders slumped, his face pale, I didn't feel triumph. I just felt done. 2 weeks later, I stood in front of the house that had once been my home. It was mine again. But as I stared at it, I realized something. I didn't want it anymore. This house held too many memories. Some good, some painful. But it wasn't home. Not anymore. I sold it. Not out of spite. Not to erase the past. but because I wanted a fresh start. Aunt Marilyn helped me find a new place. Small, cozy, peaceful. Somewhere that felt like mine. I started rebuilding. Not just my life but myself. And Jake? I heard through the grapevine that he moved out of state trying to escape the mess he made. I didn't reach out. And he didn't either. Maybe that was for the best. Justice had been served. And for the first time in a long time, I was free.